upon the throne, one of the relationship of the church and state in Ethiopia, every emperor who sit upon the throne had an agreement with the church that he's going to expand the frontier of the Orthodox Church and convert people. Menelik II did that. Johannes did that. All these other emperors who came before Haile Selassie did that. The only difference with Haile Selassie had that philosophy that religion is personal, the state is for all. So, yes, I am a Christian, but as a king, I'm equally a Christian, a Muslim, and a pagan. And that is why certain section of Ethiopia, including both Christians and Ethiopian intellectuals and so forth, they had a problem with His Majesty. And some, they were even accusing him of partaking in pagan rituals of the Oromo. There's a book called indigenous custodians of knowledge, custodians of our indigenous knowledge system. So there was a deliberate act to demonize African spirituality, to convert us into the colonial religion, and separate us from the spiritual understanding and consciousness of our ancestors, that they came here and found us practicing for millions of years before they came into contact with us. I mean, it is evidenced by their own archaeological and anthropological work that the furthest they found that the oldest human is about 3.4 or 3.2 million years, who lived in Ethiopia, called Dinknesh by the Ethiopians, or Lucy by the Europeans. But you're not talking about a being without spirituality. You're not talking about a being without a spiritual practice. Spirituality, African spirituality, is as old as the African continent. The moment there was the first African, that spiritual relationship that this African had with the universe, with the environment, with the great spirit, which we refer to as God today, is the beginning of African spirituality. So it is as old as the Africans themselves. And what is being keeping the Africans? So it was necessary, and it still remains necessary, for our colonization, that we should, for us to be successfully colonized, they have to demonize our spirituality. For us to be successfully colonized, they have to demonize our culture. They have to demonize our identity. They have to call us barbarians. They have to call us primitive tribes. They have to call us polytheistic and animistic people. They have to give us labels that largely came through the Western scholarship, like social anthropology, sociology, and history. So all of these things were necessary for our colonization. And when we say Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and their subgroups like Rastafari, Nation of Islam, Hebrew Israelites, and so forth, that they are the periphery, they're in the periphery. We don't even necessarily say they originate, all of them originate from the African spirituality, or they are byproduct of African spirituality. No. We can maybe look at the history of Rastafari. Although I was checking a little bit earlier today, I got this book from Jamaica, The First Rasta, by Helen Lee. So it's more talking about Leonard Howell, but also the evolution of the Rastafari movement. And it drew my attention to a book I read many, many years ago, The Holy PB, The Black Man's Bible. And I realized that some of the things, basically what happened is, as much as Marcus Garvey advocated practical thinking, there's one area which he neglected, which is the area of religion, or the area of spirituality, which in his attempt to correct it in 1921, he used Mr. Alexander Maguire to establish the African Orthodox Church in 1921 as a branch of UNIA, to cater for these spiritual needs of the masses of the UNIA. But also what he did was to create a Christian denomination. So, and sometimes when I do critical analysis of Marcus Garvey, I find that he was not into African spirituality. He was, I mean, you look at the first constitution of the UNIA of 1920, they talk about going back to Africa to convert the backward tribes of Africans into Christianity. So they were product of their environment. The only thing that they knew was Christianity there. As I did say that the only book that slaves were exposed to and were allowed to read was the Bible, meaning that the only religion that they were allowed to practice was something that has a resemblance with the religion of the Bible. And that is why even when we became Rastafari, we constantly contest Christianity with Christians. It's very common to hear most Rasta say, Rasta is a true Christian. You hardly hear Rasta say, Rasta is a true African, although Rastafari talk about going back to our roots and culture, particularly in South Africa. I'll use South African example because most African Rasta, when they become Rasta, they turn Jamaican. They try to speak patois, they try to imitate the Jamaican way of doing things, although some of the things is their own misconception, and they get worse because they turn against their own cultural identity, they turn against their own African spirituality, which currently 90% of Rastafari movement, apart from ones like ourselves who are advocating Africanity, African culture, African spirituality, African cosmology, African philosophy, African psychology within Rastafari. Majority of the movement as it stands, expressed by Bobo Shanti, Naya Bingi, 12 tribe, the way that African Rasta express it, and the South African Rasta in particular, they are presenting it as an anti-African movement, whereby they spend a lot of time fighting their own African heritage. Like they love what the Christian love about Africa and hate what the Christian hate about Africa. But these are conditions that were created by the time when Africans were not even allowed to identify with their African self. So, hence, today we talk about one of the struggles that Africans are fighting to be African in Africa, on the other hand. And on the other hand, we are fighting for liberation from our liberators. People who claim to liberate us from apartheid, they are still the ones who are actually perpetuating neo-apartheid.
Rastafari. I just wanted to touch on what I said regarding Marcus at the time, that Marcus wasn't pushing so much African spirituality because he was only acting on what he was taught. But it goes back to what I was saying earlier, the fragmented entities of African spirituality is the disconnect from African spirituality is what Marcus Garvey and us out here in the diaspora face, that disconnect from the actual source that the eye is talking about, which is the African spirituality is the source of I and I. So just to put a little bit more emphasis on what I was saying about Marcus wasn't pushing that African spirituality, he was only pushing what he was taught, which was the Christianity, the Eurocentric Christianity. Him now trying to reconnect back himself with him African self, rise up the whole Marcus Garvey UNIA movement, trying to reconnect back, to the source, which is, the African spirituality. So it's good that I like that, and I hope ones can can pick sense from that, because it's what we've been taught out here, and trying to reconnect back to the source. Some things now back on it, we are able to analyze and to able adjust, or amend certain things, because knowledge, increase. You know what I mean? So yes, my brother.
Yeah. No, just to add on what I say, and it's not only a problem uniquely faced by Marcus Garvey. To a great extent, we can also say that about His Majesty. I never heard anywhere I read His Majesty's speeches. I studied in Ethiopia. I have his two biography in Amharic. I read it both in Amharic and in English. Considering that in Africa, we always say that as the Bantu, our languages is Sintu, or the way of the Ntu. So we always said there is no direct translation from African languages to European languages. So it is even more clear in Amharic when we're in Ethiopia, because Amharic, it places the verb in the end of the sentence. If you are going to say God is love, in Amharic you are going to say God love is. So the is in the end. Exabir, fikr, no. So it is, the is in the end. So, but it is a greater problem in a sense that Africans, even those who are in the struggle, those who are in revolutionary organization, Pan-Africanist organization, African nationalism, Black consciousness, Africans hate everything about colonialism except Christianity. And this became the problem also with Marcus Garvey, that he was challenging everything about colonialism except Christianity. The same goes to His Majesty Haile Selassie. He was challenging everything about colonialism except the colonial effect of Christianity. And of course, you will hear others said, oh, Christianity originated in Ethiopia, but historically it is not like that. Not even biblically. In the Bible, in the book of the Acts of the Apostle, chapter 22, it said the first group of people to be referred to as Christians were at Antioch. Now we know Antioch is there in the Mediterranean, in Turkey.
Yeah.
So not in Africa. And then, of course, even those who will say, oh, Ethiopia have the oldest Christian churches, we know it's not true. Or Ethiopia was the first Christian state. It's not true. The first Christian state was Armenia, followed by Rome in 334, 32 AD, and Ethiopia was converted in 334 AD, 2 years after Rome. So Ethiopia is not the oldest. And His Majesty said in his speech that we in Ethiopia received first the religion of the Old Testament. And we're also the first to receive the religion of the New Testament. But first, you need to understand the context of it. First meaning first in Africa, because Ethiopia defined itself, Ethiopian Christianity in Africa defined itself as an island of Christianity surrounded by a sea of pagans. I have a very interesting book written by an Ethiopian elder called Tibebu Tishale. It is called The Making of Modern Ethiopia from 1896 to 1974. But it goes and covers some ancient history of Ethiopia and how the Ethiopian Christianity related with the indigenous people of Ethiopia, the practitioners of indigenous spirituality or indigenous African spirituality, like the Oromos and so forth, how they were referred to them as unbaptized heathens. They were given names like the Galas, which is basically one of the Ethiopic names for slaves, because Ethiopia practiced slavery even longer than most countries in the world. It practiced slavery until 1943 and was involved in the Trans-Sahara slavery. Trans-Sahara slavery is the same route today that Africans are using to get to Europe through Libya and Spain. That route that they are following is the oldest slave trade route that Ethiopia was following. Ethiopia had also colorism problem. The lighter skinned Ethiopians had to discriminate against the darker skinned Ethiopians. Ethiopia had a class problem. Ethiopia had a religious problem that the Ethiopian Christian regarded the indigenous African spirituality practitioners of Ethiopia, like the Oromos, the Sidamas, the Hamer, the Guragenya, all of these people, they consider them to be a unbaptized heathen. The same way Marcus Garvey reflected in his UNIA constitution that his aim is to come to Africa to convert the backward tribes of Africa into Christianity. The same way that our first African Christian in every African society, that when they were converted into Christianity, they started to look down on the African spirituality, or to look down on the practitioners of African spirituality, and have negative names for them. We do have those names even in our indigenous languages, whereby among the Xhosas you have Amaqoboka and Amakaba, Amakaba meaning the backward, those who are backward, who are unconverted, who are heathen, and so forth. And Amaqoboka is these ones who are now westernized, Christianized, Europeanized, and so forth. So Christianity has that. Because you see, these are hegemonic religion. Any religion that have the we and them concept, that we are the chosen few, you are not. We are the baptized, you are not. We are the holy, you are unholy. Stuff that you don't get them in African spirituality, because in African spirituality is like the roots of the concept I and I, that this I and that I is the same I. All life form are interconnected. Yeah. What we call Ubuntu. I am because you are, therefore we are. Yes, so there is no me and you. We always see that even if your idea of God is different from mine, but me and you are one. We always had that. Fundamentally, when we identify as spirit, that is why in Africa we never fought over God. We never fought over religion. We fought over cattle. We fought over land. We fought for thrones. Who's going to be the ruler? We fought for women, probably, but we never fought for God, because we always respected the next person's idea of God and look at it as part of the whole. And which is the holistic approach that is coming from Ubuntu. From you understand the concept of Ubuntu, Isintu, the ways of the Bantu philosophy of personal and interpersonal relations, then you're going to understand this particular world view that is uniquely African and you can't find it among Europeans and so forth. So yes, we find that the history of Ethiopia for the past 3,000 years is a Judeo-Christian history. So it's not African history in a sense of encompassing or including African spirituality, African culture, and so forth. 1000 BC, Ethiopia convert to Judaism through the Queen of Sheba and King Solomon, as recorded in the Kebra-Nagast. And then 1,000 years later, Ethiopia convert to Christianity. 2,000 years later, we have 3,000 years of a Judeo-Christian history of Ethiopia. So when people say Ethiopia was never colonized, we think, probably politically. But religiously, Ethiopia is the first country in Africa to worship a non-African God. The God of Israel, the God of Solomon, the God of the Christians. So it can be argued, we still argue that no, it's not true that Ethiopia is there. It's not true, most of the things people say about Ethiopia. I mean, I studied in Ethiopia, even when people who advocate that we must read the Ethiopian Bible. The Ethiopian Bible is not Pan-African. The Ethiopian Bible is not black conscious. The Ethiopian Bible does not advance African nationalism. The Ethiopian Bible is just the same stories, more added with the apocryphas and stuff that were extracted out of the Council of Nicaea, but there's no aspect of it which give the black pride or the African pride to the African reader who read it. So
let me ask
there's a lot of sensationalization that is coming out of the Ethiopianist movement, the Rastafari movement, and the New Age movement, which is now all over YouTube. They talk about, these are some of the reason Ethiopian Bible was hidden from the black people. It was never hidden from the black people. Ethiopian Christianity was kept within Ethiopia. It was not like the missionary Christianity of the Europeans, where they were going outside to convert other.
Rastafari. Yeah, we're here on the Mind Over Mother podcast. I'm here with Honorable Thau-Thau Haramanuba. We're, reasoning and, some
Emperor who
serious
sit upon the
topics.
throne, one of the
Yes.
relationship of the church and state in Ethiopia. Every emperor who sit upon the throne had an agreement with the church that he's going to expand the frontier of the Orthodox Church and convert people. Menelik II did that. Johannes did that. All these other emperors who came before Haile Selassie did that. The only difference with Haile Selassie had that philosophy that religion is personal, the state is for all. So, yes, I am a Christian, but as a king, I'm equally a Christian, a Muslim, and a pagan. And that is why certain section of Ethiopia, including both Christians and Ethiopian intellectuals and so forth, they had a problem with His Majesty. And some, they were even accusing him of partaking in pagan rituals of the Oromo. There's a book